Father Calabasas stopped at Dunkin' Donuts before going to St. Mary's Church of Lynn that morning. He was a Catholic priest, but he had a sweet tooth, or, as he said to the barista that morning, "Oh, pardon my sweet fang, but I might have an extra squirt of that caramel syrup in my coffee this morning." Sweet fang was a slip that the baristas didn't care about because it was Lynn, Massachusetts, 5-something in the morning, and English was not their first language. Nobody knew if Father Calabasas was a Nordic kind of pale, Swiss, or a Swedish kind of pale, but he seemed to hail from some country where paleness is a quality of the majority populace. Nobody knew if his accent was German or Transylvanian, but it was something similar. Some accents sound all the same to Americans, but the Dunkin' coffee on his breath was proof of his becoming a part of Lynn. He carried his cold brew down the aisle of St. Mary's. It was so gray outside the church that he felt he had woken up before God did. Tap, tap, tap went his shoes, working their echolocation to the altar, where he bowed and veered left to enter his office. He lit a candle at his desk. He liked candles more than using the electric lights. He sipped his coffee while reading from a book on theology and waiting for the sun to rise. His office was something akin to a captain's quarters to him. It was decked out with shelves of books on theology and world history and decorated with religious relics, certificates, and photos of him and his fellow priests. There was a picture of him and his grandmother back home who had lived to be 107. There was a picture of him and a drug addict, a 20-something-year-old girl who he had helped on a spiritual journey of sorts. He made phone calls to her every couple of weeks and checked in, and she was doing well. There was a photo of him at a baptism for quadruplets. He looked delighted in all of these photographs, but his pale and gaunt draconian features betrayed him. Physically speaking, he was a paradox because he simply looked too ghoulish to be a priest. He sat down at his desk because he wanted to get some reading done before the 7:30 Mass. A thud made him turn his eyes away from the text and towards the ceiling. "Hark the herald pigeons sing," he said to himself. He blessed what he thought were pigeons with a chuckle. He delighted everything that lived, and he liked finding different aspects about different creatures to delight in. He appreciated how some pigeons cooed despite how humanity discarded them. He always decided to give them greeting glances when he happened upon them in the parking lot outside of St. Mary's. He liked the pigeons cooing, and in turn, he liked the seagulls' perseverance. When he found a spider descending from the ceiling of his office one afternoon, he cupped it in his hands and carried it outside. "Don't let the pigeons make a meal of you, little friend," he told the spider, then let it down into the turf of the grass along the sidewalk. And how did he treat the ultimate creature? The one that cooed like pigeons when it prayed. The one that found a reason to preserve. The one whose heart sometimes seemed to be dangling above the precipice of hell by one cobwebby string. He treated his fellow man kindly, whether he saw him in church or not. A louder thud came. "Huh," Father Calabasas said, looking up from his text again. "That's one big person." He looked back down at his desk with his eyes, treating his Dunkin' cold brew the same way they had treated a mystery potion. There came another thud that made the priest raise his eyebrows. Then there came a great creaking from above that made the rest of the church shiver. Father Calabasas stood up. He looked up at the ceiling, and his voice was quite the injury in his eyes. But the boards of the ceiling seemed sworn to a new secrecy, or had they been so frightened that they had lost their tongue? He maneuvered around his desk while keeping his eyes up on the ceiling the whole time. He wandered out of his office and out into the main body of the church. It was still empty, but less gray, for precursory sunlight was touching the stained glass windows and just shyly lighting the church's interior. He shuffled down the aisle with his head back and his eyes up. The roof sounded like the groaning hull of a ship. It was so great that Father Calabasas quickened his pace to the exit of the church because he thought the roof might collapse in on him. He was letting out a "what?" when the sound of a giant bell creaked open this morning. It seemed that the bell's signal echoed within the shell of the atmosphere. Father Calabasas hurried out and down the marble steps at the front of the church, while the bell's signal droned lower and lower until its sound finally ceased. He appeared utterly baffled. He shimmied into the empty parking lot while the employers of the bank across the street filed out to find the source of the ringing. Again, a bell boomed out in the morning, but the thing was that St. Mary's bells were retired. They hadn't been rung for decades, not since the 70s at least. As far as anyone knew, only seagulls frequented the bell tower at the top of St. Mary's, nesting and leaving white droppings, but never ringing the giant bells. It rang again before the second sound could settle down. Father Calabasas could just make out the startled chatter of the bank employees across the street, until their voices drowned inside the metallic roaring of the bell. He spun around in the parking lot and looked up. He gasped. There on the gable at the bell tower was the silhouette of somebody, tall, muscular, hairy, a hominid of some sort. Its arms were lanky and long enough to reach into the bell tower. Because of the sun's triumphant rising, however, whatever stood on St. Mary's roof was only visible as a silhouette. Father Calabasas' gasp mimicked the bell and continued on until it echoed out of existence. The silhouette was black as ink in front of the creamy orange-yellow morning light. Why, the thing was blocking out the sun itself. The bank employees started screaming across the street as the thing on St. Mary's roof rang the bell again with a janky but mechanical jerk of its arms. The screaming of the crowd across the street below must have agitated the black mass atop St. Mary's roof, for it started ringing the bell in greater succession. It jerked its arms back and forth more quickly, and now the great bell set all the little bells within the bell tower to panic. Father Calabasa would have sworn he heard the thing hooting underneath the agitation of the bells, but before he could zero in his ear on the barely audible hooting, the sounds of sirens scared the thing away. It left while the bells radiated their metallic echo into Lynn. He kept his face in a gasping expression while watching the thing slide down the roof and disappear behind the church. He noticed how tawny the thing was with hair, like bristles on a ruined paintbrush. It was covered in hair. This was the last thing he noticed about it, though. Father Calabasas took a step deeper into the parking lot. Oh, how the black mass had disturbed his pigeons. He needed to go and chase it until he remembered the crowd of people across the street. He turned around before he could continue deeper into the parking lot, and he saw how the people huddled together. Even the bank security guard had an unsettled expression on his face, while the women clung to him. The bells had ceased to echo when Father Calabasas crossed the street. He put his hands out and levered his arms down in a calming motion, like a conductor quieting the band. "It's all right, everybody. The thing has ended. The thing has ended." "What was that thing, Father?" asked the security guard in a thick Bostonian accent. How strange it was to hear a Bostonian conveying fear. "Well, it was quite big," Father Calabasas said, sounding sarcastic. "I think we can all come to an agreement on that." "Oh, Somebody has to catch it, the old bank receptionist squealed. Christ, Father, what the hell was it doing up there ringing the bell? The security guard asked. His face was red and seemed about to pop with sweat. A police car pulled up and parked on the curb of the sidewalk outside St. Mary's. The cop hopped out of the car and stood beside Father Calabasas, making the two of them immediate partners. It was a man, the old bank receptionist shrieked at the police officer. But before the officer could inquire further, the security guard blurted out, I wasn't no man, hell no. I saw that thing, officer. Thing? The officer inquired. Bastard must have been 10 freaking feet tall, the security man complained. I saw it, officer. All the employees cowered. They took turns looking up at the bell tower in front of the yellow morning sky before looking back into the huddled horde they had formed. What a sour hollandaise sauce was that sky. The police officer turned his attention to the calmest member of the bunch. Father Calabasas widened his eyes when he saw a call for responsibility in the officer's eyes. The priest cocked and tilted his head as if his skull was a bingo machine, rotating to the winning number. I guess you saw it too, Father, the policeman asked. Just a shadowy version of the thing, Your Honor, Father Calabasas said, matter-of-factly, and it was quite hairy, and tall, like he said. These crackheads are evolving, the police officer said, while shaking his own head. Oh, no, sir, Father Calabasas said, hunching towards the police officer and speaking in a low voice. See, I've assisted in the rehabilitation of a few of 'em crackheads in my day, and you see, well, I don't think any of them got so hairy and tall because of their habitual bane. Well then, how do you explain this, Father? The police officer asked in a low voice. Oh my God, the old bank receptionist shrieked. It was a giant monkey. Was it, Father? The police officer inquired. It was monkey-like, Your Honor, Father Calabasas said, after a moment's hesitation, but he didn't sound quite sure. You guys might want to keep an eye on the police logs tomorrow, the officer chuckled. I'm gonna take down everybody's statement. I'm sure I'll be able to find you inside. Eh, Father? Yes, I'll have a rendezvous with a bygone cold brew in there, the priest prophesied. The conversation that the priest and the police officer had was inconclusive. They conversed in his office, and the inquiry only seemed to cement the situation into a more bizarre molding, for the police officer believed the priest the most amongst all the other witnesses. Father Calabasas went into detail how he had heard the thud and heard the ceiling cracking before he hurried out to see the thing ringing St. Mary's bells. He left out the detail of the thing hooting, because he still wasn't completely sure of it. By the way, Father, the police officer said, shaking the priest's hand, you called the judge Your Honor, although I don't think you'll ever be seeing one. What do I call you? Tommy, sergeant, officer, your fellow man, the police officer said with a twinkle in his eye. I'll get out of your hair. As I understand, you've got mass soon. I'd rather you in my hair than a giant monkey thing, Father Calabasas joked. The two chuckled, and the police officer left, leaving the priest alone in his office with an empty Dunkin' Donuts cup on his desk. Coincidentally, the bells began to ring when he hung up the phone. How politely did the priest treat the nuisance? He didn't even bother to go outside and try to see the thing, for it was the same time as was the other day when the same thing had happened. He knew what it was, but he didn't know why it was so attracted to the St. Mary's Church, to his church. The rest of the day carried on as normal, but an escalation occurred the following Monday morning when Father Calabasas was waiting for the barista to make his cold brew. There was a television in the corner of the room playing the news. Authorities are still investigating the bizarre incident, but still no one can explain what creature was on the security footage of the grocery store. The news anchor said while the footage cut to the footage of a grocery store aisle. It showed shoppers hurrying away from a hominid with orange hair, twice the size of the fleeting shoppers, as it ransacked the shelves of food. Because the footage was from above, only the head and shoulders of the creature were visible, and its visage was covered in orange hair, but its fingers were somewhere between purple and black. They were very long, thick fingers. 3 Stop and Shop employees have quit following the incident, and Stop and Shop has made an official comment about the situation, saying, "We here at Stop and Shop appreciate our customers of all different shapes and sizes, but do not condone this kind of behavior. We apologize for the disruption at our Lynn location on Washington Street the other day," the news anchor reported. This coming mere hours after another bizarre incident at St. Mary's, where the thing was reportedly sighted ringing the church bells before fleeing. "Get yourself on the nearest Mayflower and come up here," Father Calabasas said into the landline phone in his office that morning. Dr. Milton Kellogg arrived the following Wednesday afternoon, carrying his bags and suitcases into St. Mary's, which then smelled like the cardboard-tasting communion wafers and candles. Father Calabasas was in his mass attire, a white robe with a green stripe down the center, when the doctor hurried up the aisle. "I came as soon as I could," Milton croaked. He had a nasally voice that so desperately wanted to be British. "But I didn't come all this way for you to try to convert me," he said, when coming to a stop before the altar. Father Calabasas' face became lit with amusement. He seemed to be waiting for the opportune moment to laugh. "Old friend Milton, how are the alligators?" "Business is booming," Milton said, despite the disinterest in his voice. "The Dianoska skull is a real draw for the little children. Just as long as you keep them away from the real hungry living alligators," Father Calabasas teased. "Oh, have you seen the movie Lake Placid?" "Yes, I did, Tobias, and in my opinion, it's ridiculous." "I hope we have time to go and see a less ridiculous movie when this whole thing is over," Father Calabasas mused. He still seemed very amused. Milton squinted behind his glasses. His acquaintance's amusement always perplexed him. "This whole thing, your request was quite urgent, Tobias. I wish you had done some explaining over the phone. Perhaps I thought you wouldn't have come. You must instill some better belief in me, Tobias," Milton sighed. Even his sigh was disinterested. "Well, why don't we start with what you saw?" Father Calabasas went on to describe the events of the bell ringing. Milton opened up his laptop, and Father Calabasas directed him to the footage of the thing in the grocery store. "I don't believe it," Milton said, in a kind of elongated gasp. "Well, you better believe it, my friend." "No, I don't believe it," Milton said, while stroking a non-existent beard. "It seems to be a Gigantopithecus blackie." "Uh-huh, and what is that?" "An ancient species of primate that went extinct in Asia 200 years ago, give or take," Milton said. He lifted a pointed finger and started tracing his equations in the air in front of the laptop screen. "The aspects are unmistakable. Its size and orange hair. It's a distant relative of the orangutan, but it's supposed to be an ancient relative, not living, you see. I've seen it ringing my church bells. What did you call it again?" "Gigantopithecus," Milton answered breathlessly. "It was supposed to have died around the time that humans were leaving Africa." The both of them went silent, remembering their previous conversation and friendly debates. The silence was agreeable because both subconsciously knew that today was probably not the appropriate day for a friendly debate. Besides, either one already knew that they couldn't sway the other with their opinions. Finally, Father Calabasas broke the silence. "Some things come back from the dead, Milton." Another silence came while they rewatched the footage of the grocery store. "Are there any zoos around?" Milton asked. "The Stone Zoo, but this is far away and they do not have any orangutans or anything of the sort. Could it be a new species?" No, it's Giantopithecus, all right, Milton mused. What makes you so sure? Because you called me for help, Tobias. The utterance of his first name made Father Calabasas flinch, but he remained composed. But can you riddle me this, Dr. Kellogg? Father Calabasas waved his fingers while beginning to pace in the area between the pews and the altar. So, what if it is a Giantopithecus? Well, that's a mystery in of itself, but why did the creature, not once, but twice, ring the bells of my church? The bells of which no one in Lynn are old enough to remember ever hearing. Well, I'd say monkey see, monkey do, but you say those bells haven't been rung in years. Decades, Father Calabasas hissed. Pongo Pygmatheus, that's orangutan to you, have been recorded quite comically, driving golf carts, using saws, and doing very human things, Milton explained, although there was an air of uncertainty in his voice. Oh, Milton, if you saw how urgently this thing rang the bells, Father Calabasas explained. What are you suggesting, Tobias? That this thing, this Giantopithecus, was doing more than monkey see, monkey do, Father Calabasas explained. I theorized that this was an act of desperate spiritualism, a monkey in search of God. Milton was so enamored by the priest's monologue that he was fearful of the church organ coming to life in a melodramatic song, but it didn't, so he listened and hoped that no church music would begin playing. Father Calabasas went on. You're of the party that believes humanity springs from the apes, right? Yes, Milton said, a little amused, but Giantopithecus is not an ancestor of mankind. He is man-like, Father Calabasas shrugged. He made shrugging appear so much like a move in a musical. When in your books did ancient man develop religion, or did we search for it? Is this Giantopithecus ringing the forgotten bell to, shall we say, see if God responds to him? Shall we say, to summon God? Does it want to learn? Tobias, you are thinking fantastically. Why, of all things, Milton, would the Giantopithecus come to my church and ring the bell? Father Calabasas emphasized, and although Milton was a staunch atheist, it made him go silent. I'm going to ask you a question that I fear to ask, but I must ask. Is the Giantopithecus dangerous? A 10-foot-tall primate, Milton sighed. Generally, orangutans are not aggressive towards humans, but those are orangutans. Little is known about Giantopithecus. Put one in the modern-day civilization with cars and traffic and pedestrians out for walks, children playing on playgrounds, children playing outside during recess. We might not desire experimenting with waiting just to see how Giantopithecus behaves with modern man. Father Calabasas thought of screaming bank employees. He thought of how the shoppers in the grocery store fled. I mean, Giantopithecus has the teeth of the gentlest herbivore, but again, primates have been known to become territorial. Is my church in danger? If this thing returns and causes a panic during Mass, there's no telling how it would react to human panic, Milton answered. The two became silent again. It would have been a good time for the church organ to come to life and provide some kind of daunting melody, for they didn't want to fill the silence with more theories, or worse, fill it with predictions. What do we do, Milton? We find it, we learn about it. And what do we do if it comes back at the wrong time? Father Calabasas said, rephrasing his question and making it sound dire. How do I protect my flock? Do you mean firepower, Tobias? You know guns aren't allowed in church, Milton teased. He didn't smile, though. How long do you plan on staying in Massachusetts, Doctor? Father Calabasas asked, after deliberating in himself and his mind. Now, Milton began, I plan on staying a lot longer than I initially planned. Father Calabasas passed the background check, and on Saturday night, he wasn't getting ready for Mass in the morning, but he was sawing off the barrel of his newly purchased double-barrel shotgun. There was a bandolier of shells hung up on the wall, while statuettes of Mary held their arms out wide, as if shrugging in surprise. While sawing off the barrel of his new shotgun, he thought of that comment Milton made about an orangutan using a saw. The sound of the saw teeth biting into the barrel filled his office while he worked by candlelight. The barrel toppled onto the floor and let out a hollow clang that was similar to the bells. Father Calabasas held up the sawed-off shotgun and examined it, examining how the orange candlelight reflected on its black barrel. "I dub thee, little flock," he told the shotgun. He then turned around to the lever-action rifle and considered sawing off the buttstock and barrel as well, but was unsure. It was a Marlin Model 336, and he had already decided to name it David, after the David and Goliath story. Had anybody ever pitied the giant? This he contemplated while babysitting his new purchases in his office. He remembered how urgently the black silhouette rang the bells. It gave him a sense of dread, but also a sense of pity. It was a sense of sympathy. Was it a sense of sympathy? This thing, it reminded him of the abominable snowman from the 1964 Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer film. He used to watch it every Christmas when he was a boy in his snowy village, and the abominable snowman always frightened him greatly. Father Calabasas trekked into Lynn Woods the following Sunday afternoon. Milton wore a Davy Crockett hat with a raccoon tail attached to it. He also wore a beige safari uniform with the pants tucked down into his combat boots. Father Calabasas wore his black cassock. He looked as ghoulish as always, but he looked alert. "Ah!" Milton yelped when Father Calabasas drew Little Flock from within his cassock. Luckily, he did this while they were deep enough within the Lynn Woods. "Do you have any idea how illegal that is?" Milton asked, but Father Calabasas didn't care. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," Father Calabasas quoted, but this did not assuage Milton at all. "Did you not bring a gun, my friend?" "A gun?" Milton squealed. "Yes. Don't you use one of those revolvers when tiptoeing around your alligators?" "Yes, but that is in South Carolina. I have a revolver, not a sawed-off shotgun. We aren't Bonnie and Clyde, Tobias." "I believe he used a sawed-off rifle, but his sweetheart used a sawed-off 20-gauge. That's not the point," Milton squeaked. "We have a Giantopithecus to catch, Milton. This is for protection," Father Calabasas said. Milton looked to his side to see the priest cradling the shotgun in his arms, the way someone might carry a little lapdog against his chest. "There's an old legend about pirates who buried treasure in these woods, Doctor," Father Calabasas mused, amongst the crunching of his footsteps. "They say he died in an earthquake. Thus, the term Dungeon Rock is now a sort of tourist attraction in the woods. Dungeon Rock. It's a stony crevice in the earth underneath a wedge of boulder," Father Calabasas went on. "I know about this only because a youngster I befriended used to crawl into the crevice to shoot up. It's dark and damp. A real den down there it is." "Have you been down there before?" "I did. I went with the youngster one night to go and collect her discarded needles when she finally decided to turn over a new leaf. I tell you this in confidence, of course, but I am proud of her, and this forest brings up memories. She studies at the North Shore Community College now. Oh, but I haven't seen her in a while." Milton simply listened to the priest while they walked. In fact, the more they walked, the more they remembered their friendship, and the less they remembered the Giantopithecus. They laughed about the first debate they had had at Cambridge. Their friendship was built off of disagreement, but also a kind of respect for each other. They both knew that the other possessed a propensity for learning. It was what they talked about while Milton put vinegar on his fish and chips and Father Calabasas dipped his fries in tartar sauce. "Oh, I love tartar sauce," Father Calabasas moaned as the two scaled the hill in the woods that led to Dungeon Rock. Milton threw his hands up as the two stopped. The gesture made Father Calabasas regret his wild profession of love for tartar sauce, but the forest didn't move. No crows flew away, but they remained in the branches where the sun had beaten through in lime-colored flakes. "Do you see this, Tobias?" Milton whispered, while reaching into a tuft of long orange hair. He grabbed the tuft as gently as he could and pulled it out of the tree bark like wool. "The hair of a Gigantopithecus," Father Calabasas gasped. Milton put the tuft of hair up to his nose and sniffed. "The sample is fresh," he said, snapishly. "Look around for prints or more tufts of hair." Father Calabasas started doing so, but the earth was too dry for prints, and they were in the hills near Dungeon Rock, so there was too much gravel within the dirt. He unfolded his arms and drew his shotgun while the two crept into the opening in the forest where Dungeon Rock was. "There it is," Father Calabasas said. "The entrance to Dungeon Rock. I don't think the species could squeeze in there." "But we can," Father Calabasas said, gripping Milton's arm when the Gigantopithecus emerged out of the trees. How yellow were its eyes, its face, a purpley bruised visage. It opened its mouth and roared, displaying yellow canine teeth and flinging spit into the air. Father Calabasas pulled Milton into the entrance of Dungeon Rock just as the Gigantopithecus swiped at the two of them. They nearly tumbled down the wooden stairs and would have been digested by the dark stomach of Dungeon Rock, but Father Calabasas caught himself. He held on to both Milton and his shotgun. The two caught their breath while listening to the agitated breathing of the Gigantopithecus. Its breathing amplified into a hoot and then into a shriek. Very little sunlight leaked into the stairway in Dungeon Rock while the two sat listening. They mastered their footsteps on the stairs, intaking the primal odor of the Gigantopithecus while it continued to complain in discordant hoots and shrieks above the entrance to Dungeon Rock. They could smell its breath, and it smelled like swampy pond water. Its body odor was doggy, almost as pungent as a cow. They reminisced about its arms. Oh, its biceps. Had it indeed grabbed a hold of Milton, there was no telling what would have been done to the paleontologist. They must have hunkered down in the stairway for 20 minutes while waiting for the beast to amble away. Oh, and the heartbreak Father Calabasas felt while replaying the scene in his head. Although the species had perhaps tried to do something significant by ringing the bells, it simply could not be allowed to. Those were not its bells to ring. Such thoughts ran through Father Calabasas' mind while he held on to his friend and his little shotgun. "Tomorrow night, Milton," he whispered, "we must bring the Gigantopithecus to its end." "Tobias, you must understand. We caught it off guard." "It's too dangerous," the priest hissed in a whisper, his voice being carried down the stairwell of Dungeon Rock. "How angry it was when we entered its domain today. How angry will it be when our Lord doesn't answer to its baying at the bells? What rampage will be sent into when it's denied by God? Then it will truly become the ape that it was always meant to be." The ending notes of the priest's mini-speech echoed down the stairway, being carried down into the dark stomach of Dungeon Rock. "Then it will truly be the ape it was always meant to be. To be. Milton took a deep breath through his nose. He was too frightened, even still. "It will ransack the streets of Lynn," the priest hissed. "It will overrun vehicles. It will turn its victims' skulls into bells." Milton was too abhorred to speak. The plan was simple. Milton was stationed in the bell tower, while Father Calabasas waited at the altar with his shotgun and lever action. All the candles in the church along the pillars were lit, with the altar being the most lit area of the church. He was curious, the plan also acting as an experiment, for there was a plate of communion wafers and a goblet of red wine on the altar. Would the Giantopithecus accept the Eucharist? Did the Giantopithecus perhaps, on some level, possess a misty understanding of ceremony? Father Calabasas wanted to know. The father flinched at the first tolling of the bell. He blinked and reminded himself of his mission. He looked down the long aisle between the pews, looking out the church's open door and imagining it would be big enough for the Giantopithecus to crawl through. He swallowed his dread and kept his eyes on the doorway as another tolling sounded. He imagined how scared his friend was, but he reminded himself again that this mad idea had a purpose. For some time, Father Calabasas listened to the bells from above. They weren't ringing the way the Giantopithecus had rung them. They clanged more meekly, not as urgently. The bells ceased. Silence fell upon Lynn. Father Calabasas retained his composure when the thing came in from the street. It crawled up the marble steps outside and bowed its head while crawling to fit through the doorway. But it got on its two hind feet when it entered the aisle. It was no longer just a split-second episode in Linwood. It was no longer a silhouette. The Giantopithecus stood there, yards away from the priest. Father Calabasas inhaled as calmly as he could through his nose and tried his best not to show emotion while sharing eye contact with the Giantopithecus. Its yellow eyes seemed wetted by the candlelight, its woolly coat of orange hair covering its body aside from a plate of purple muscle on its front side. Its mouth and nose had a protruding nature. It looked alarmingly more like a human than an orangutan. Oh, but it was so unnaturally tall. It looked alarmed to see the priest, or was that its natural visage? Father Calabasas tried to keep his hands from shaking while he picked up and offered the plate of communion wafers in the air, which now was a battle of scents of the Giantopithecus and the warm scent of the candles. "The body of Christ," he murmured, in a voice he hoped only God could hear. The Giantopithecus just stared blankly at him. Was there some kind of recognition in its yellow eyes? "Is this what you want, Father Calabasas?" asked the Giantopithecus. But it didn't answer. This didn't mean yes, but it didn't mean no either. "If it is, I'll bring it to you in the woods every Sunday evening." The Giantopithecus didn't understand this either. It blinked and sniffed the air while looking at the priest dead on. It cleared its throat in a low grumble and curled back its lip in perhaps some kind of an attempt at communication. It sniffed the air further, and somehow Father Calabasas knew it was trying to smell the communion wafers. Was there a sense of familiarity being tied to the air between them? The Giantopithecus stepped forward, beginning its descent down the aisle. Father Calabasas kept the plate of communion wafers in front of him and waited. "The body of Christ," he repeated, in a voice that was clearer than earlier. He gulped. The Giantopithecus was extending out its long arm. It was actually reaching for the plate, and it made Father Calabasas' heart throb so much that he could have smiled. The Giantopithecus swatted the plate out of Father Calabasas' hand. The air was a glitter of communion wafers for a second, while the plate clanged to the floor. It roared while diving at the altar. Father Calabasas ducked just in time and grabbed his shotgun. He crawled away from the altar while the Giantopithecus turned around. The shotgun blasted out a tolling of its own. The Giantopithecus roared in anger, but the buckshot had created little violent polka dots along the side of its purple chest. It closed its eyes and continued roaring. Father Calabasas fired a second time. He could hear the flesh being ripped off its shoulder when the buckshot splashed across the air. His whole body trembled while unlocking the shotgun and letting the barrel down. The thing was charging at him. He dove into a pew before he could reload Little Flock. The shotgun shells which he held went rolling away, rolling down another pew and another. The creature's fists shot down and cracked one of the pew benches in two. Boards and splinters erupted into the air. Father Calabasas climbed over a pew, catching a glimmering brass shell on the floor. He picked it up, shoved it into the shotgun, and flipped the barrel back up. The Giantopithecus regained its footing just in time and brought both its fists up with the vigor of an executioner's beheading axe. Father Calabasas pulled his finger down on all the triggers all the way. The Giantopithecus threw its head back immediately when its forehead caught the brunt of the buckshot. It had been so close to Father Calabasas that its head had caught every ball in the volley of the round. Its deflating roar came in conjunction with the wet crack its skull made. Father Calabasas watched the Giantopithecus make one final expression while it fell down backwards. Its mouth was open as if it wanted to let out a final hoot, a final prayer. The church echoed with the thud its falling body made. Father Calabasas panted while watching streams exit gracefully out of the wedge at the top of its forehead. The wound reminded him of the entrance to Dungeon Rock. Milton hurried into the church while Father Calabasas watched the violent liquid pooling out of the Giantopithecus's skull. "Thank God you're all right," Milton said, sounding like he was breathing for the first time. "'Tis quite the time to thank God," Father Calabasas said, while turning around to face his friend. "Did it reach for the communion wafers?" "There was a moment where I thought it was," Father Calabasas answered, matter-of-factly. He held the shotgun out limply, now that it was empty, suddenly remembered he was holding it, and was startled by it. "Oh," he laughed, "I better go hide this before the police arrive." "Yes, you better," Milton murmured. He was a bit astonished at his friend's resilience, or was it a lack of surprise? It made him start to wonder if his friend had actually performed the rites of exorcism before. Part of him really didn't want to know. Gunshots aren't the most abnormal thing in this part of the world, but they're very abnormal from inside St. Mary's, so the residents surrounded the church and notified the authorities. "Gunshots?" Father Calabasas said to the police officer, while Milton was finishing dragging the Giantopithecus's body down into the church basement. The priest was stalling the cops on the front steps outside the church. "You know, now that you mention it, a loud noise did wake me from my nap, but there might be mice in the church rafters. Don't tell anybody. By the way, do you know any good exterminators, Your Honor?" They had used ropes to pull and drag the behemoth primitive along the floor until they let it tumble down the basement steps. Milton wanted to bring it back with him to South Carolina for further study without the pesky government involving itself, but there was something that unnerved him about the Giantopithecus, even though it was dead. It picked at his mind and turned his consciousness into a scab while he stood over the woolly orange body of the thing, Father Calabasas distracting the police outside. An ape that as Father Calabasas had stated, presented an act of desperate spiritualism. Was Milton's heart breaking, or was his mindset evolving against itself while he loomed over the body of the Gigantopithecus? He certainly had never scaled any religious buildings to ring a bell. He couldn't remember any time in his life where he was enthralled in an act of desperate spiritualism, but this ancient ape was. So, Milton and Father Calabasas readied the body for the remaining hours of darkness that came after midnight. He got a rental car when the sun came up, and the two struggled transporting the cadaver into the rental car. They shook hands, and Milton drove away, besides a couple of incidences on the highway where Milton felt the car was going to lift forward into the air to balance out the 1,000 pounds of ape in the back. The commute went smoothly. He spent a couple of days transporting the body in his homemade lab near the alligator farm. He spent even more dissecting and preserving the body, but it was when he got to the head that a familiar fear entered him, and it led him to call his old friend in Lynn, Massachusetts, in an act of desperate spiritualism. It might have been one of the strangest things to happen to Lynn, Peabody, and Salem, and nothing like it has happened since. It was a fleeting incident that we talked about in a "did you see that" kind of way, and not really talked about it any further. It was a singular occurrence that rippled through the Essex County civilians like a benign earthquake. Most people were too distracted to see it going by, and only caught the tail end of it as it scattered down the street. For the human race is never ready for these sudden moments, so sublime that they border on horror. In April 2022, Lila Concord happened upon a book of Corbin Chatterton's poems in a moment of pure serendipity. Lila herself was 31 and played the organ at St. Mary's Church in Lynn, Massachusetts. She found the volume of Chatterton's poems in the South Branch of the Peabody Library on a particularly warm day. It was sitting dusty and neglected behind a row of 19th century novels that included Wuthering Heights, Emma, and Far from the Maddening the Crowd. Here, this bygone poet hid behind the statue of the English greats, an American child playing in their shadows. She reached for the volume the way you'd reach to scoop up an injured mourning dove, something which had cooed outside her window that morning. "Oh, I forgot we had that," the elderly librarian cooed, with her voice creaking with apology. Her eyes practically flew through her spectacles and onto the volume with both remembrance and inquiry. "Corbin Chatterton. He was born in Salem, you know, buried somewhere in Piney Grove Cemetery in Lynn." "It was kind of hidden behind the English classics back there," Lila explained. The library took on the brevity of a bazaar. The librarian walked into her own memory to shill out a bargain. "Yes, he was an early romantic. He couldn't quite seem to launch himself into literary stardom like some of the others, though." Lila felt the injured mourning dove twitch its wings within her chest. "Oh, what happened?" "I think it was 1825 that he got very sick and died. It might have been consumption. His poetry lived on through some small presses. I believe this volume is an original from 1823. "May I check it out?" "Honey, I don't think anybody's ever checked out this book. I myself even forgot it was here. I'll let you have it as long as you want." "Thank you. You said he was buried in Pine Grove Cemetery?" "I believe so. Well, you see, originally he was buried in a potter's field somewhere in Danvers, but when Pine Grove was established in 1849, his surviving brother motioned for him to be moved there. His brother worked and worked to afford a proper tombstone for him, a don't remember where in Pine Grove he is exactly, but he's somewhere in there." "Alone?" Lila breathed. "Naturally," the librarian said, and took the book, opened it, and stamped the receipt before sticking it in the first page. It had no prior stamps. "What did the young man write about?" "I haven't flipped through that volume in a while. At first he was obsessed with the sea. Then, I think, he began going batty and started writing about love." "One has to be batty to write about love?" Lila snickered to herself. "Batty as Corbin Chatterton." "Ma'am, how old was he?" "I think early to mid-20s. He was an apprentice of some sort before poetry whisked him away. He had no higher education. He was just one of those late symptoms of Shakespeare." Lila, having no response, turned the volume over in her hand, a movement that made her beaded bracelet jingle. "I'll have to take a look at it today. Thank you. You have a wonderful day, young lady, and enjoy the beautiful weather." She gave a charitable smile while stepping backwards towards the door. "Oh, I will. You too. Bye." And carried Corbin Chatterton back out into the world, into spring weather that the poets and romantics would have gone hysterical for. She took the volume over to Pine Grove Cemetery, the grounds of which were enclosed by a tall cobblestone wall caked in moss. It was quieter than the library. All the tombstones, Madonna statues, and crosses ranged from the kind of stone Medusa's eyes introduced to the polished copper pennies they would never be again. She carried the volume over to the dip in the land where there was a turtle pond frequented by ducks. She sat down on the lime-green lawn where its rainwater smell welcomed her, and all the turtles sunned themselves on the rocks of the pond. The turtles were such content aliens with black heads that had yellow stripes and eyes concentrated in an outer space serenity. Their content was contagious, and it put Lila in the proper mood to read poetry that was 199 years old. She read some verses aloud to herself as if to make sense of them. "They made eternity for only two. We mustn't count the wedding's thunderbolt. They made eternity for me and you." She flipped to the next page. She was careful with her voice, knowing literature and poetry needed a diligent vessel, and that even reading poetry alone was still a responsibility. Her voice was meticulous as she read a new poem to the turtles. "Today I set a cooing pigeon free. Into the radiant tomorrow flew a dove to find my lover yet to be. I watched it near the sunset's golden hoop, and joined its luster as the portal closed, to find a woman that I've yet to know." Lila read, and she imagined a young man in a white blouse with loose cuffs, donating a morning dove to the sky in a celebratory manner. In her mind's eye, she saw the dove, shrinking and shrinking, as it flew away until it vanished, and she thought about the mourning dove that had been cooing outside her window that morning. It ached her, because she could only imagine the majority of this pigeon frere battling the identity crisis of being a silhouette, faint stripes of sunlight to break up the shadows of its figure. She could picture him releasing the bird, and she could picture him being 80% silhouette, even though the poem stated absolutely nothing about it. It was a short one," she said to the turtles. Then she started another poem. "I hear the organ, but it's far away. I hear her rosary jingling. Oh, what a gallows is a maiden's wrist, a future knuckle that I've never kissed. The organ music jumps between our times. I hear the thunderclout distort its hymns, which would have played the day our wedding day, a sound no church in Salem claimed to make. I asked the organist to play again and imitate what I heard to him. Oh, but the hymn I heard must not exist, for what he played I did not recognize, but still, sometimes the humming leaves my lips, and though alone, in love I am today. The poem finished, and something came over her. It does exist, she shouted at the open volume. That line, "Oh, but the hymn I heard must not exist," caused this aggravation in her. She had shouted with the air of being in the thrall of a romantic quarrel, a couple arguing in a kitchen, but she was just in front of the turtle pond in the Pine Grove Cemetery. She had sounded so desperate to get some phantom husband to realize something, but all she did was make the sunning turtles retreat their heads into their shells. The beads of her jangling bracelet when she turned the page. The beads of her bracelet jingled when she turned the page. Beyond the universe's growing pains, the nebulas who take so long to stretch, I think my love is in the future days, and woe that just my ghost will know her breath. She mumbled, the poetry having administered some sedative to her narrative voice. "Corbin," she whined sympathetically under her breath. She brushed her finger over the tan pages as if to disrupt the seeds out of the poetry. But all the words had already been planted and sprouted. She looked up from her volume at the turtles. They were just starting to poke their heads back out with the languid speed of sunrises. She felt as slow as them. She returned her attention to the poetry and read quietly, no longer reading aloud so as to keep her from shouting again. She ended up remaining quiet for so long that the turtles might have started believing that she was one of the Madonna statues, if a Madonna statue got up, sat down, and took off her shawl. The volume was 121 pages. Some pages had 2 poems on them. Some just had 1. And some poems rambled on for 2 or 3 pages. They weren't all about the strange long-distance relationship the poet had, but some were mundane and about nature, typical poet things. Some were about mortality, or celebrations of Jesus' sacrifice, but most of those 121 pages harbored poems of this strange long-distance romance. And when Lila had time to feel what she had read, the analytical part of her mind started awake, which only deepened her curiosity. "Oh, honey, I said you could keep that book for longer," the librarian cheered when Lila entered the south branch of the Peabody Library the next day. The librarian's face was red and puffy with joy, while Lila, everything about Lila was alive. Beads on her wrist jangled as she stomped, not walked, and her black tresses bounced. She had gotten a little pink from sitting in the sun yesterday, and now there were 121 pages of poetry in her eyes. She looked angry to have not known about the volume sooner. "Have you ever shouted at a book?" Lila asked, to which the librarian shrugged. "Not in here, not since I was a girl, but yes, plenty of times." "When the narrator was wrong about something?" "Honey, I find sometimes the narrator is often right, but we just don't know how to accept it. That's how you know it's a great story. Why, did Corbin Chatterton ruffle your feathers?" Lila didn't answer. Instead, she looked down at the volume and thought of the line that made her shout, "Oh, but the hymn I heard must not exist." She didn't shout now, but felt her unbridled rebuttal echo within her. "I guess he moved me," she admitted. The librarian's smile was enough to make the April sky outside even bluer. "I just needed someone to talk with about this collection," Lila said, in another admission. "Well, I'm certainly not busy now," the librarian said. "Looks like it's just us in here, honey. Why don't we dissect some of it together?" "I'd like that," Lila said, and though separated by age, the two shared a smile. The librarian waddled out from behind the desk, and the two sat at a table with the rustic rainbows of book spines behind them. They went through the poems that affected Lila the most, but the whole time someone was knocking on the door of a cottage in her mind. She did her best to ignore it because she wanted to be polite, and nod while the librarian read a poem, gave her 2 cents on it, and then read and analyzed another. I think this one summarizes Corbin's feelings of how the realization of expectation is constant. See here, a string in time, my finger interrupts. I feel, not hear, but feel, the summer air I pluck. Geez, that's beautiful, isn't it? It is, Lila agreed, but where did that pride in her voice come from? Play on, the great nothing I wrote myself. Today's tranquility will be enough, the librarian read. The pointer finger plucks, the middle plucks, and then sometimes it twitches in my thumb. Ah, see? I love that. The librarian held up her hands and wiggled her fingers, drawing a pleasant chuckle from Lila. Is this the only work of his you have? I can call the main branch and see if there are any of his other collections, but yes, as far as I know, you are in possession of the only Corbin Chatterton work we have in the South Branch. Very interesting, Lila said, thoughtfully, her eyes consulting the closed volume on the table. Did you have any idea of where he's buried? No, honey, I'm sorry to say I don't. As I said before, he's in Pine Grove, but I'm not sure which section or lot he's in. I think I'm going to go look for him. The librarian sounded very sorry that she had to laugh. Honey, there's almost 100,000 people buried there. That place is over 80 acres. And how many poets are buried there? This made the librarian think. She spoke for a moment and considered. I will say you can veer from the military section, as I do know he didn't serve. It'll most likely be an old tombstone. Not sure how legible the name and the date will be, or if there will even be a name on it. Are you sure you want to do this, honey? I feel like I have to know after reading him, Lila said, but then she snickered, and the snicker seemed to be hastily trying to fasten a mask over her face. She dipped her head and looked back down at the closed volume. Where are you, Corbin? Lila asked herself that afternoon while she was walking through Pine Grove with a pen and a red notebook in hand, which she was planning to write a composition in. But she didn't want to start writing it until she found the poet's grave. Maybe creativity was equaled by death, and she wouldn't be able to find him. The only good thing was that it was a beautiful spring day, and the smell of freshly cut cemetery lawn dispelled the grass's earthy breath. She applied sunblock on her shoulders so that the smell was there, but the cold smell of the sunblock had gotten shy in the presence of the smell of grass. She walked and looked. She passed down the rows of tombstones, walked the hills, and ignored the mopey-headed trees that tried tempting her with their shade. The sheer amount of tombstones quieted her, and the more she walked, the more she began to feel that this one cemetery seemed bigger than Massachusetts itself. It also distorted her sense of time after seeing the collection of dates, all embedded in stone like 1,000 different Chinese fortunes. But they all ended up saying the same thing, which was, this person was born, and then they died, and this person was born, and then they died. The numerical possibilities of her own species almost put her in a trance, would have made her forget what she was looking for, but just as she had found the volume by chance, that's how she found his grave. It was uphill, standing short with castle-like posture. Corbin Chatterton, 1801 to 1825, read the tombstone. The letters were only visible because they had been carved, and the wrinkles on the tombstone had not caught up with the masonry yet. Atop the hill was a large oak with branches that sprawled out to form an umbrella over the daycare of tombstones. Corbin's tombstone was 80% shadows, broken up by 20% sunlight that managed to cut through the leaves. It was comforting to know that his tombstone had a ballet of sunlight and shadows to play on it all this time. Lila took a breath and sat down beside Corbin's tombstone, opening up her notebook and beginning to write, humming different notes and progressions to herself quietly so as not to disturb the dead. She wrote many movements and variations of the same movement, humming to herself and making corrections along the way, sometimes even starting all over again. What she was doing was composing more than a poem. Poetry is for the conscious, music is for the subconscious, thus explaining the almost torpid state she entered into, while inspiration whisked her away, her pen the whip that kept the steed in flight. That's what Corbin would say. She practiced on the keyboard in her room that night, making corrections and changes to her sonata along the way. Halfway through the composition, she decided on titling it as Corbin's Sonata. Its melodic and somber tones were hindered by the prissy range of her keyboard, but she knew it would sound all the better on the organ in St. Mary's. Still, even when she played it on the keyboard at 3 a.m, she couldn't help but remember how she had imagined the silhouette of the man, striped in sunset orange, that almost revealed his identity, releasing a mourning dove up into the sky. Corbin might have described the sonata as having come from a sunset. It sounded like a triumphant, yet subtle, happy ending to a life cut short. "Father Calabash, do you mind if I try something out on the organ today?" she asked the next day, while standing in the belly of St. Mary's. Father Calabash was in his black cassock with the white necktie, his eyes piercing, his skin pale, his voice of some Central European and slightly vampiric origin. Father Calabash drew his pale aurora borealis eyes up to the indoor balcony of the church, where the organ was. Its brass pipes and their many frowns were always quite the thing to see, and the machine always had monstrous promise to it. "Why, sure, I don't see why not, Miss Concord. Is it practice you seek?" said the priest with the Dunkin' coffee on his breath. She hesitated, almost dropping her red notebook. "I wanted to try writing something." Oh! Well, I was about to go out and trim some of the bushes in the parking lot, but if you want someone to give it a listen, I'm good, Father," she said warmly. "I don't want to keep you. I will most likely be able to hear it out there anyway," he said, and patted her shoulder before bundling out of the church, ready to grass stain his black pants. Lila turned behind the confession booth and took a flight of stairs that were in a cramped chute. The church's anatomy was that of wood, and not of brilliant marble and granite that are the colors of far-off temples. She proceeded to the organ like it was any other morning in Mass, and sat down. Opening up her notebook before her, there was more opportunity in an organ than any piano or keyboard, and the title she had written above the sonata seemed so promising aboard the steampunk-style instrument. Corbin's Sonata. That moment, when her hands hovered down towards the keys, was such a detrimental silence. It was like sitting in the theater and truly not being able to determine the ending of the movie. For one reason or another, her fingers hovered there for a moment. She might have imagined the man who was almost silhouette-elating underneath an orange watercolor sky. Maybe sunsets were redder back when the tragedy of Salem was fresher in the sky. However, the sky was bright blue that day in Lynn. Her fingers pressed down on the corresponding keys, and immediately the pipes came to life. It was like a resurrection for the wrongly dead. The swarm was a swarm that seemed to have started nowhere. It was in a hurry through Essex County, tens of thousands of mournful doves, all in a violent commute, not just above the streets, but through them. A lady who had been walking her little dog ducked and laid on her stomach when the swarm passed. All their wings were so fast and small that it was amazing that wings as thin as playing cards could let such plump doves accelerate the way they did. Cars lurched to respective stops in that intersection that the witch house in Salem is. The swarm was such a brief reflection on their windshields. From here, the swarm ascended, but seemed indifferent to flying too high. No, these birds' business was not in the sky. The swarm slithered and winded through residential neighborhoods, some where nobody saw them, and some where people did. They curved up and over buildings when they had to, but always came curving back down, slinking in roller coaster finesse to wherever they were going. The librarian in the South Branch Peabody Library was too involved in the book she was reading to see the blur traffic past the window, but its sound alerted her, and she looked up from her book. So did a couple of other patrons, but too late. Horns honked. A child reached out of his stroller and giggled with the two bubbling teeth it had. Dogs yipped, not out of malice, but out of an absurd understanding with nature. The falcons that hid in the trees stayed themselves from chasing the swarm. Seagulls in many pothole-infested parking lots remained grounded. Father Calabasas was intrigued with the sound that was coming from his church while he stooped over to weed a strip of mulch from which some hedges grew. It enhanced his gardening duties. The music sounded as misunderstood as toccata and fugue, triumphant as 99 Red Balloons, and as tickling as Vivaldi. And Lila's fingers tickled the keys as if she had been playing it all this time. Perhaps the song was always in her. That's why she played it so well. She just had to write it down for it to exist. Exist? It did exist. Her pleading shouts at the turtle pond had been worthwhile. The more the sound came out of the church with the attitude of a newly wedded couple, and the more Father Calabas progressed down the rows of hedges, the more he wished that the piece was something that he could play in his car. He wished he had it to listen to on his way to Dunk's, on his way to church, on his way to the house of the elderly, when supplying communion. Something cut the air. A shadow entered down the street that St. Mary's was on, and Father Calabasas turned to see the swarm of mourning doves shooting towards the church. Being not afraid, he stood still and watched the swarm fill the space between houses, the sounds of all those wings unfolding and folding the air. The swarm was as long as an unwound fingerprint, and it took a while for the entire swarm to amalgamate around St. Mary's. It created an ever-turning vortex around it, flying, flying, flying in a circle. When the swarm was finished arriving, Father Calabasas stepped back and craned his neck, watching the tornado of mourning doves churn. They all flew so fast, but so eloquently, without crashing into one another, that it seemed they had the grace of fighter jets. Oh, but this was a peaceful thing. The priest watched with his jaw open until Corbin's sonata ended in the sorrowful chuckle of some apologetic but happy notes, and the swarm started uncoiling itself from the church. This took some time as well, given the length of the swarm, but eventually the church was rid of it, and the swarm ascended until it became faint as smoke, growing smaller and smaller until Father Calabasas saw nothing but a blue April sky. But how strange it was to see one mourning dove falling out of the air, its wings working rapidly to cool its re-entry. It landed on a telephone wire and looked down at the priest. It looked at him and cooed like a curious cat. "Oh, your wings must be tired, little friend," the priest said, despite the distance between him and the telephone wire. And just like that, it ended. Lila's fingers retreating from the keys. The only sound in the church was the faint jingle of the beads on her wrist. Had she seen the swarm outside the stained glass window? I'm not sure. We have to leave her now, but I think she sensed us. Part of her must have heard our wings berating the air and sending feathery winds against the church. I saw a swarm of mourning doves crusade in unison into the candle cloud. Their light wings have such a sky to break, their little wings against their bellies pound. A stanza by Corbin Chatterton, 1823. I loved something that couldn't love me back. It only knew how to imitate me. I met Violet Mirage when the city I lived in at the time was becoming hyper-developed and increasingly modernized. I first noticed it when the McDonald's in the city installed those touchscreen kiosks. I remember trying it one day after work, not because I was hungry, but because I was curious. I was like an old man trying to type in his password, sluggishly moving his finger along because the font was too large and I was forgetting my password. I don't know why, but the installment of these touchscreen kiosks in McDonald's made the skyscrapers outside seem taller and the streets below deeper. The bright blue sky was receding from the earth, being pushed away by the growing buildings. These were the portraits in the gallery as the earth shrank into hell. Touchscreen kiosks and McDonald's. Neon lights began overcompensating for the loss of enthusiasm from the sky, and all I can compare what my city became to is Seoul or Tokyo. The sidewalks were asphyxiated by advertisements. The street lights were no longer calm yellow, but surgical white, attempts to be brighter than the sun. It was on a rainy day in the city when the McDonald's touchscreens were broken. Her voice came from behind me. "Have you used it before?" It was the delicate whisper that made me regress in age. I was a quiet kid in school again, and it felt like everyone in McDonald's should have been napping. I turned around. Her eyes were brown, like cherries, so dark that they seemed more brown than red. She had the slightest tan to her skin, not from the sun, but from whatever Mediterranean ethnicity she was. Greek, maybe. Sicily. All those centuries, just to end up being a woman in the city. She was in a white nurse's uniform, with the red circle and white cross on it, marking her and making her look like a parody, more than the real thing. Her hair had obviously been dyed blonde, so I noticed the dirt color at the root. She smiled. "Couple of times," I answered, in a shy chuckle. "What's the matter?" She moped, and I felt as if she was about to do a medical exam on me, right there. I tapped the touchscreen over and over again, pressing my finger on an unresponsive square. "I think it's frozen." She bit her lip. You really only want a cheeseburger, huh?" I looked and saw that was the option I had been fervently pressing. "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do." "Here," she said, stepping past me. "Let me help. I'm good with technology." I watched the touchscreen respond to her touch. "We're gonna get you 2 cheeseburgers today. I only want the one, because I'm going to eat with you," she said, twirling around when the order was complete. "That was fast," I marveled. She waggled a finger at me teasingly. "I told you, I'm good with technology." We waited for our order, got it, and sat down by the window. The dreary city outside the rain-flecked window, our only real backdrop. "We use tablets at the hospital," she explained while we ate. "Sometimes I have to check in some of the older patients when they come in." "So, I'm like them?" I asked. "No," she almost giggled. She chewed and swallowed, becoming suddenly thoughtful. "It's all online. It's easier that way. The older people don't get it, but one day we'll be as old as them, and everyone will understand." "I never thought about it like that," I said. "See, like this touchscreen thing," she said. "They already have the technology. They're just implementing it slowly so everyone gets the hang of it. We grow together. We update together. I think I'm behind on a few updates." "I'll catch you up," she said. "I'm Violet, by the way. Violet Mirage." We shook hands over the McDonald's table that separated us as a car whizzed by outside, splashing rainwater against the window like rice being sprinkled at newlyweds. "I got to admit," she said, nodding to herself, "you have that grandpa vibe. What kind of phone do you have?" iPhone 5? What about you?" I asked out of politeness. 15. "That's the newest?" "No, 16 is." "Oh, look who's old now." "Stop it," she said with a smile. My smile wasn't as... what's the word? My smile wasn't as exuberant as hers. Being a nurse, I assumed that she went to some kind of college, and the college years were fresh in her eyes and even fresher in her smile. It made it hard to believe it was raining outside in the city. We walked outside together. "I wish I had an umbrella for you," I said, above the sound of the tap-dancing rain. "Oh, what a gentleman." We walked closer to the buildings than the street, the rain being colored from all the lights of the billboards and the signs. When you have a tech-savvy, exuberant, and personable woman practically on your arm, well, the world feels different in a city becoming so different from what you're used to. We went through the human ritual of small talk. Where'd you go to school? Where are you from? Favorite childhood memories, usually accompanied by a laugh, a pause, and then a proclamation of some not yet granted wish. It was the kind of easy conversation that makes the walk slower, so the walk lasts longer. And I thought I noticed Violet being possessed by a kind of cruise control, matching my languid speed. She did so perfectly, but I was encouraged enough with her voice and her college party eyes to notice her consciously. We were in my apartment's kitchen a month later. "They are easy to make," Violet shrieked with laughter as I hugged her from behind in a playful tackle. But no matter how much I jostled her in play, she didn't drop the packet of instant mashed potatoes. "You're trying to poison me," I joked, still not letting go of her. "It's cheaper than potatoes," she laughed. "I already have a pot of water on." "Water?" I let her go. "Yes, did you read the directions on the packet?" she asked sassily, her college party eyes flaring. "I'm not reading that blasphemy. My great-great-grandmother was Irish. I want real potatoes." "Well, the real potatoes are left behind in Ireland." She opened up a packet and poured a beige dust into one of the pots on the stove. "This is the real American potato now. But it's fake. We met at McDonald's," she reminded me. I didn't need to say her humor was perfect. My silence said it for me. She did have a point. The more I wondered, the more I noticed the cardboard garlic aroma coming from the pot. "And think of all this time you're saving," she said, crumpling up the empty packet and throwing it out. It had taken her a while to remember that my garbage can was in the cabinet under the counter, but she knew it now. They don't call them instant mashed potatoes for nothing. Just a few minutes later, Violet was airplaning the spoon into my mouth and watching my reaction as I tasted it. Taste was all I had to do. I didn't even have to chew. It melted straight into my throat, and it was pretty good. But everything culminated that night in a kiss so savory that we might as well have been having Michelin star potatoes. That was what she was good at, kissing me. I admit the memory chills me. Instant goosebumps. We moved into the suburbs a year later when Violet left the nursing field because of the stress of her schedules and workloads. She got a job as a receptionist for a dentist in the city. We could afford it, though, because I got promoted at work. We got a mortgage on a house on a street called Sprawl Street, which wasn't too far away from the city we met in. All the houses on Sprawl Street were the same, suburban, middle-class paradise purgatory. But because we were so excited about having our own home, Sprawl Street was more than heaven. It was the finish line of the American dream. I'm humble in my excitement, but she took mine and amplified it in hers. Her college party intensified. Her smile intensified so much that her eyes had come into a squint, for she couldn't handle the shine of the happiness of our new house. We have a real house. Can we have real potatoes now? I asked after her as I twirled around inside our empty living room. She hesitated before musing. I like the taste of instant potatoes. But have you ever had real mashed potatoes? Peeled them, boiled them, waited and waited for them to get soft, mashed it yourself, and put in all the ingredients? It probably doesn't taste as good as instant, she moped, and because I loved her, I forfeited my potato campaign. All right, I said, you got me hooked. And besides, baby, you can mess up mashed potatoes somehow. You can overcook them and leave them in the water too long and they become soupy. You can undercook them and they become chunky. But that instant potato is just right every time. Tastes good. Pretty consistent. Can't mess it up. I mulled it over. Our house will smell like instant potatoes then, I said. And that smell smells like garlic-infused cardboard. Fake, but it tastes good. Was that really so different? Our house on Sprawl Street slowly came into itself, filling with furniture and decor. At first, it was similar to us spending the night in my apartment in the city, like we used to. But something changed. Violet began to become what I can only call homesick. It appeared in her face and manifested itself in the strangest ways. She glitched. I was thinking about the city, she said, and how the rain used to sink down from the buildings. She was saying one night while leaning on the granite island of our kitchenette on Sprawl Street. The kitchen was white, contemporary, fluorescent. I was, believe it or not, making dinner and tending to a pot of instant mashed potatoes on the stove. There was a roast and green bean casserole in the oven. Well, you still work in the city, don't you? I said, which she responded to. But I don't sleep in it. I don't wake up in it. It doesn't go to bed with me. I'm not a part of it anymore. I just so happened to look over my shoulder after she said this, and I saw her glitch for the most fleeting of moments. It was as if the human body was made of billions of thin Jenga blocks, and for a moment, one of hers was pushed back out and in. Instantly, the rogue layer of her pushed itself back in. I pretended not to notice it because she seemed not to notice it herself. I did let my voice meander a bit. Honey, are you feeling okay? Her voice pepped up. Honey, I'm fine. Why don't we go into the city more often? Find something to do in it. Make a day of it. I think, she said, that would be good. The days went on. I got a cold, but she didn't, and the precautions I took to keep her from catching it worked. She dyed her hair back to brown, and then to platinum purple, a weird kind of color. Maybe it was because we had a bigger closet on Sprawl Street, but I thought her wardrobe was growing. We were growing into Sprawl Street. I kept our lawn the same as everybody else's. We made friends with our neighbors. How could we not? Our houses were exactly the same. And, like most young couples, we fell back in love whenever we re-entered our house. We recreationally went into the city on weekends. Her college party eyes lit up as if someone turned on the brightness outside her while we were in the city. I accompanied her on shopping expeditions. She clung to my arm when we crossed the street. We watched them apply a giant black screen in front of a mural, the black screen being one of the billboards that rotate through advertisements. She never glitched when we were in the city, but her brightness auto-corrected itself when we got home. What I thought had been a one-time thing became reoccurring, and it never happened when we were in the city. She was on the couch the second time it happened. It happened in her neck. A thin layer of her figure was pushed out and back in again. She hadn't even noticed, but I did. The third time it happened was after a shower. Her hair was back to brunette, and she was tying it in front of the bathroom mirror with a towel wrapped around her. I just so happened to be crossing the hall when I noticed. "Hi, honey," she said, turning and looking away from the mirror to smile at me. A layer came out in front of her neck, and another did the same at her waist. When did I know that her love was artificial? It happened gradually. Denial made it difficult. I started asking her questions of the soul while we were lying in bed. "Why do you think we're here?" She turned her head on her pillow. "Why we're here?" she asked, mulling over the question. "You wanted to buy a house of your own." "No, I mean alive, living, breathing, existing." "Well," she said, turning her head away, "it's what you make of it." "But what do you make of it? What's your opinion?" "There's no known answer, so I guess I just don't have one. It's not something I think about," she said, and glitched, a layer of her existence jetting out at me and quickly repairing itself. Out of curiosity, I went to my phone and asked OpenAI the same question I'd asked her. To make a long story short, OpenAI said not the exact same thing as her, but something similar. It gave me a long paragraph of philosophical garble about how many people have so many theoretical ideas, but there's no absolute answer. I asked it to summarize the answer, and its answer was that life is what you make of it. Of course, a human would probably say the same thing, but was her answer and OpenAI's answer similar for a reason or just coincidence? That night, when she got home from work and told me that she was researching new job opportunities, I held her. We were standing in the center of it, and I just held her and wished she was real. "Honey," she asked me, while gently swaying, "is everything all right?" "Yeah," I lied like her. I caressed her arm. Her skin felt real. Her skin felt so real. I took a deep breath and decided not to lie, but embellish the truth. "I just had a dream that you weren't real." "Not real?" she said. "That's silly." I pinched her arm. "Ow!" "Just checking." "Honey," I said, jumping into the house after work. Violet was upstairs in the kitchen when I came up. She had her laptop open on the granite island, probably surfing indeed. "We're going on vacation." "We are?" she asked. I whipped the travel brochure out of my pocket and let it frisbee onto the island. She looked at the picture, the Golden Gate Bridge on the cover, and meekly said, "California?" "What do you say? Even better, I'm renting a convertible so we can drive the Pacific Coast Highway." My excitement was a little artificial. I was more nervous than anything. Because she only glitched outside the city, I wondered how much she would glitch when we were all the way in California. I know it's crazy, but part of me was still convinced that she was real, that she was just as human as I was. She was sweet. She loved me, but the love was hollow. And it wasn't love. I knew this in a subconscious level, and it was something that wouldn't be unlocked to the courtroom of my consciousness until afterward. Violet was back to blonde now. She was wearing a yellow dress. She'd been glitching the whole entire trip. Even her voice had a delay to it. She looked worried, and once again, the brightness was down in her college party eyes. Her lagging got progressively worse the further away we got from the city, and the closer we got to California. It was when we were cruising on the highway on the side of a cliff when she showed me the new emotions that she had learned, dread and revelation in her college party eyes. It was that sobering moment when you realized that you were too far gone but had a full red Solo cup. It was the moment you remembered that you have an exam tomorrow that you haven't studied for. It was the moment of betrayal you feel when you realize someone knew your deepest, darkest secrets and they were going to use it against you. All that was in her eyes as we cruised. I was wearing sunglasses to keep out the bright California sun. I wonder if she could see herself and what was happening to her in the reflection of my sunglasses. How juxtaposed it was, the turquoise Pacific behind her as she parted her lips. The view was so beautiful. The Pacific Ocean might have actually been the deity that invented the word breathtaking. But Violet's reaction, the way she stared at me, the realization in her eyes, it made the crystal clear water and the emerald broom's edge down the base of the cake almost apocalyptic. And that was just how she looked at me as she started glitching for the final time, like the apocalypse was upon us. Her face flickered in and out of existence, never ruining her beauty as it came back. Her neck started doing the in and out of place layer thing, and her ears fell and came back up as if confused on where ears were supposed to be. The convertible was moving as smoothly as a spaceship, no gravity to bother us. We were cruising. The wind was roaring, and she was coming apart like paper, the layers zapping back and forth. Finally, she vanished. Connection was lost. The seatbelt that had been over her slung back into place. All there was to look at now was the Pacific Ocean. I felt free, but I knew that the face she made in the final moments had been imprinted onto the touchscreen of my mind. She was gone, and all I had to do now was drive as nature roared triumphantly at me. I was 30 years old when the North Shore area of Massachusetts experienced the most alien windstorm in its history. This was sometime in 2018, and my grandma was 85. It was the whirlwind that made me realize she had a life before mine, that she existed before me, existed before my mother, and I guess was her own person. It was her first time experiencing life, too, just like me. Of course, you know your grandma's a person, too, but the sobering revelation that she wasn't always your grandma is intense in a quiet sort of way. It was the windstorm that made me realize that the little girl in the black and white photo was her. The photograph taken in 1935 had a dusty brown hue clouding over it, and it showed my grandmother in a dress beside a rocking horse. Her cheeks had the leftover insulation of baby fat, and her mouth was open because the English language was still too big to fit in there. She looked confused in the photograph, like all children universally do before a camera. Whenever I had seen that photograph, which was usually in the kitchen, on the table, in my grandmother's house, I couldn't bring myself to believe that that was her. How many times had I flipped the picture over to read Dorothy, 1935 on the back. And how many times had that not solidified that it was her? Dorothy Springfield was born in 1933 during the Great Depression, and there had been times when she talked to me as if she remembered every second of it. But I find that hard to believe as well when I see that photograph of that little girl. Mom would have put the clothes on the line while Dad was at the pond fishing for eels for supper, she told me. I mean, maybe she remembered the final year of the Depression, but I just couldn't believe it. My hands used to get so cold while putting up the laundry, she mused wonderfully. I would stand on the buckets to reach the clothesline. That was my chore. That was how I helped out. She had my baby pictures on the fridge, and I had a better inclination that that was in the past compared to my inclination that the little girl in the photographs was my grandmother. Some stories of hers that I remember included one where she crashed her first car in 1950, and another when she broke her arm in the 40s as a teenager. But she hadn't wanted to tell her parents because she feared they'd be mad at her. She did eventually tell them when she couldn't get the clothes on the line. And then she became, well, old, but adapted to the modern world, spending the evenings multitasking games of poker on her phone and an e-book on her tablet. Yet she had occasional phone troubles that I helped her with, but she, for the most part, knew how to navigate technology. I, after all, can't say I ever put clothes on the line. I liked my grandmother's stories. Were they my grandmother's stories? Or were they Dorothy Springfield stories? I saw her in the flesh, and saw the photographs of her as a toddler, her in that new car that she crashed, her in a wedding dress with my Elvis look-alike of a grandfather, but there always remained this intangible disconnect between Grandma and Dorothy Springfield. To her, I was all one person, grandbaby Ronald Springfield. To me, she was Grandma, not Grandma Dorothy Springfield. I wonder if my grandma found some similarities between the news on the TV that day and the radio broadcast about the dust storm that she might have listened to as a little girl. Whatever it was, it puzzled the meteorologists. Still, they read the weather and circled their hands over the radar map while tracking the windstorm. Oddly enough, there hadn't been any rain, despite the cloudy disposition outside. The day outside was sick with grayness, and the trees along the border of the neighbors' houses were having their branches tested by the wind, waving one way and then waving another, with their leaves possessed with the cadence of a million uncoordinated jazz hands. We watched the news while the windstorm was underway outside. One clip showed an old lady who looked like Susan B. Anthony crossing the street, shuffling along with her walker before flipping up into the air with her whole entire body spinning like a punted football. The old lady was not identified, and unfortunately, she was not the only one. We all knew that their walkers weren't going to help them up where they were going. I remember they showed footage of staff at the local nursing home nailing boards of wood across the windows. They even got up on ladders to board the second-story windows. They said that the nursing home's third-floor occupants were evacuated to the first and second floors in a rush. Airplanes weren't grounded because of the wind, but grounded because of one close call from pilot Captain Milton, where he circled over a suburb outside of Boston before coming into land. On the news, they played the audio of Captain Milton reporting his sighting to air traffic control of an old lady being sucked through some current of wind, just narrowly missing the side of the plane. Many passengers who had their windows open corroborated the report. The news reporter, a young Asian American woman, held our attention while she spoke. First responders and witnesses in the area remained baffled by the unexpected weather, and even more baffled by who the unprecedented wind seems to affect. They cut to a clip of another elderly woman being dragged up into the sky and carried up over the rooftops of a residential neighborhood in Lynn. It cut back to the news lady, who continued speaking. Authorities warn that female members of Massachusetts' elderly population might be at risk of being blown away. If you or a loved one you may know are over the age of 60, Massachusetts law enforcement and first responders are suggesting that you refrain from stepping outside until the wind settles down. With that, I'm Antoinette Untilly, Channel 5 News. I turned the TV off and looked at my grandma. For the first time in 8 decades, the English language was too big to fit in her mouth, so I tried cracking a joke. How old are you, Grandma? 59? The wind landed a heavy punch against the side of the house, as if it knew she was inside. She spoke as if I'd never made the joke at all. Roland, dear, what's it look like outside, in the park? I blinked. I was a little worried, but I got up and looked out the window anyway, to check the park that was across the street. My eyes widened when I saw an old woman in jogging attire, holding onto the fence at the park while her feet hovered in the air. She had on green neon wristbands and a pink neon headband. I couldn't quite see her face because her entire body was at a 90-degree angle while the wind was trying to rip her off the fence, but I knew she had to have been at least 60 because of the 1980s style jogging wear she had on. What do you see, Roland? My grandma squeaked from behind me. The wind was just too much. I watched the elderly jogger get vacuumed into the sky. Nothing, Grandma, I lied. Does anybody need our help? Our help, I said, in a kind of surprised hiss. I turned around and saw my grandma was unfortunately serious. You're a strong young man. She had always believed that, ever since I was a lanky middle schooler. And I'm nimble, and you're many things, Grandma, I said, walking away from the window, but she continued speaking. Can't we go out there and help guide any lost stragglers inside? People shouldn't weather this wind alone. I couldn't hold back the disappointment on my face. Either you help me, or I'm going out there alone. You heard the news, Grandma, I snapped urgently. You can't go out there. I can't go out there alone, she said matter-of-factly. Okay, I said breathily, noticing the determination in my grandma's eyes. We'll go out there, but we're going to do it my way. I'm going to tie a rope or something to my waist and tie the other end to yours. We'll look around, and if we can't find anybody, then we'll come back inside. I could tell that she didn't like the idea of going back inside, but there was a stubborn agreement in her eyes. Roland, my grandmother squealed while we trudged out onto the front lawn. I twisted my torso in order to hold onto the rope behind me because I could feel the wind trying to take my grandma away. She was holding onto the rope in front of her. There was something so fragile about her. She was not holding onto the rope. She was not holding on to the clothesline from 80 years ago, but she was holding on to an umbilical cord. I had to speak just to snap myself out of whatever trance this realization was about to put me into. Come on, Grandma, I wanted to shout, but I just couldn't. For all that talk inside the house, she was just so frail. Still, she trudged behind me while the wind threatened to pull the very silver hair out of her scalp, while it barely tussled mine. We crossed the street where the smell of peppermint was stale in the air. Somebody's laundry was running loose in the air above, with sleeves of a red sweater flapping in its wake. We walked along the fence the old jogger had been holding on to, and we entered the park through a gate. The playground was abandoned, and its swing sets creaked in the wind. The baseball diamond was also abandoned, and though no kids were playing soccer in the field, the soccer net was still catching volleys of wind. It looked as if 1,000 invisible soccer balls were being hurled into the net. My grandma saw it before I did. "Oh my goodness," she squeaked. It was Belinda, one of the women in my grandmother's book club. She had a little lapdog named Mop that was working its tiny legs across the grass, yapping up into the wind while its leash was dragged along. When I looked over, I saw what he was chasing and barking. His owner, Belinda, 78 years old, was floating away. Mop was chasing after her, even though he had no chance of catching her. She had her arms outstretched, snow angel style. The wind rolled her up, taking her over the playground where Mop followed, and she vanished, up, and away. "Belinda," my grandmother called. "Come on, Grandma," I urged. We carried on as the sound of Mop yapping faded out behind us. "Grandma, look out," I shouted as a mobility scooter came crashing out of nowhere. It just narrowly avoided us, but the impact shook the ground enough to make my grandma lose her balance. I went back and helped her up. "Roland," her voice starting like an engine. "Roland." At first, I was confused until I saw what was happening with the balls of her feet. They were lifting up and off the grass. She slapped her hand down on my shoulder, alarm in her eyes. "Roland," she squealed. The rest of her started slowly hovering off the ground. Her fingers slipped off my shoulders, and now the only thing keeping her from floating away was the rope that connected us. "Grandma," I started tugging on the rope, tugging and pulling it into my side, but the wind demanded her. I was playing tug-of-war of mythical proportions with a gale, and my grandma was at stake. I watched her hold out her arms in front of her, keeping her arms up and out as much of her joints and bones would allow, while some invisible force seemed to be suctioning on her back and trying to vacuum her away. An old lady tumbled by in the distance over her shoulder. I started digging my feet through the grass, beginning the trek back to my grandma's house, while my grandma floated above me like a float in the Macy's Day Parade. Her voice was becoming part of the wind. "Roland!" Closer and closer to the gate. I was getting closer to the gate. "Roland!" Another old lady came barreling through the air and grabbed onto my grandma. "Please," the old lady spoke hoarsely, "you've got to help me." I could feel the addition of the old lady having a negative effect on the rope. For some reason, the wind must have thought 2 old ladies were much better than 1, so now it was pulling even harder. But now I was in the street, and I was getting her closer to my grandma's house. "Roland's my grandson," my grandma told the old lady. "He's gonna take us back to my house. He's a good fella." I was in the driveway, my feet suddenly gaining the speed of snails. I was approaching the front door, but the weight of the 2 old ladies was too much. The rope's many veins began to undo themselves until it snapped. "Grandma!" I called as I watched my grandmother and the other old lady recede into the sky. They separated from each other and circled each other, moving like figure skaters that lost their mind, going in and out of the vortex, circling the drain of the windstorm until they shrank in the distance. The wind was only bothering my hair. It didn't care about me. I gulped and looked at the sick pearl sky for a while, waiting for it to give my grandma back, but It never did. I must have stood outside my grandmother's house for an hour that windy day, just thinking, just waiting. For some reason, that was when my grandma and Dorothy Springfield morphed into one whole person. The wind roared as if it was applauding itself. Something up there was satisfied with its actions. How many other grandmas were now being slipshotted through the current far away where the wind returned to, where the wind stirred the amalgamation of old ladies. How many grandmas, old women, were being lost in the wind and time. I knew one thing for sure. One of them wasn't going to be lost to time, even if she blew away.